don't get distracted by this terrible, I made this earlier. We're not going to use this in the first half of the talk. I work for the Synthesis Institute as one of the lead facilitators and as the director of program and product development. In the past, I co-founded the Guild of Guides Netherlands together with Miriam and Marta and some others that are not present here today. And I got some questions about that, but please, Nigel and Miriam, if you can raise your hands, like questions about the Guild of Guides. It's wonderful people. I recently co-founded a psychedelic think and practice tank that we provisionally call the Kushala Collective, where we're really trying to investigate what best practices and what ethical practices look like in offering psychedelic care. And finally, I have a private practice as a Buddhist and Psychedelic Chaplain. So it's a kind of quite of a joy for me to offer this talk on integration, especially because I think integration can make the difference between a good experience and a transformative one, or a really bad experience and a transformative one. So wherever you come from in your experience itself, integration and especially integration support can really make a big difference. I'm also going to advocate to widen our understanding of what it means to offer integration support. So if you're already a professional, and I know that some of you are here today, some of the stuff that we're going to go over is much more familiar to you. But if you come here for the first time or you have a lot of experience yourself and you're interested in how can I deepen my own integration process, or how can I offer support to a friend, I hope you're going to walk away with some basic pointers. I'm going to set my alarm because I'm terrible at timekeeping. So today the main thing that we'll do is we'll explore how I have been thinking about integration, and we will explore 7 different dimensions of integration. That is cognitive, somatic, emotional, spiritual, relational, behavioral, and creative. And I'm going to spend a lot of time focusing on the relational element, also because Marta, when she invited me, she initially invited me after I gave a talk on the need to have concentric circles when thinking about integration. And this is really thinking about the self, but also about our relations to our community, to our wider ecologies, to our cultural and even political landscapes. So I'm going to try to take integration away from something that you do on your own or with your therapist, and to kind of like re-embed it, or kind of like bring our awareness to the fact that it has never been disembedded from the communities that we belong to, the people that we live together with. I will also offer a definition of integration and how it differentiates from what I call continuation, and I'll offer some reflections on why I make that distinction. In doing so, I will talk about seeing integration as a sort of spectrum that runs from wholesome integration to challenging integration, without making one of them good and one of them bad. It's very much about how smooth and easy is this process going. I propose that a key feature of wholesome integration is the normalization of human experiences, including psychedelic experiences that are challenging. And I propose that we can do this through broadening our awareness of the diversity of human experience in general. And primarily doing this through professional support, but as I say, I think community gathering in the way that we're coming together right now is important, and I will also advocate for considering civic engagement as a form of integration. So to use more mystical language, if you've come from the mountaintop and you've reached your enlightenment, it's time to go back to the marketplace. I will spend a good chunk of time on relational integration, as I said, and that's going to be, I think, maybe towards the halfway point of this talk. I will also offer a lot of slides. You're going to see them later here. I can make my slide deck available, so you don't have to take notes if you don't want to. I know that everyone learns in a different way. But we'll go over the 7 dimensions of integration, and in each dimension I try to kind of show this is how wholesome integration could look like, and this is how sort of like challenging integration could look like. So we're going to go over quite a few different things. Before I move on, could you hold up those 2 books? Because a lot of the work that I'm going to discuss is in these 2 books. Mark Ashela wrote an epic book called Psychedelic Integration, and a dear friend of mine, Kyle Ortigo, wrote another book which is chock full of exercises and different ways to approach your own psychedelic experience. So if anything that I'm going to share today sounds familiar, it's because as everyone in this field, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, including the best practices from a lot of indigenous people, a lot of people that have been thinking about psychedelic harm reduction. So I'm deeply inspired by their work, and where possible, I will try to reference them and also tell you when I have a slightly different approach than some of their core ideas. Is this clear? And is this tempo something you can follow? Or should it go up or down a little? It's good, okay. So as I said before, I discern between integration and continuation. Now in a nutshell, integration pertains to the period around the psychedelic experience and directly deals with the material that is brought up by the journey itself. And integration, I think, serves 2 purposes. On the one hand, to support the organic growth and development that is inherent to the holotropic process. And I'm going to talk about that word in a moment. And then on the other, it's the minimization or the mitigation or the reduction of risk and harm that is associated with coming out of a psychedelic experience. And I use the word holotropic, and that means to move towards wholeness. And whenever you hear me talk today about healing, I want to be very clear about what I understand to be healing. It's not becoming a better human being. It's about becoming a whole human being, including all the messiness that we have, including our shadows, including our fears and desires, and including this profound notion that we're in this together. So we're deeply interdependent or interbeing. I cannot exist apart from you, but also apart from this entire world out there and anything in here. I'm not going to go over the philosophical edge yet, but this is really something that deeply informs how I think about healing. It's relational. So it doesn't exist in a vacuum. You're not doing it on your own. And I really want to echo what Camille said earlier, that's a shift that we, I think, collectively need to make when we think about integration. This is not an individual endeavor. We're in this together. So continuation, on the other hand, refers to a sort of deeper and an ongoing process of waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. Or in other words, continuation is how and why we live. Continuation covers the holotropic or the healing process itself, and we are always continuing our life, but we aren't necessarily always integrating our psychedelic experience into that life. And integration is part of continuation, in that our psychedelic experiences can impact how and why we live. And vice versa, thinking about how we wish to continue living can be a part of integration. There's a couple of differences that I want to bring awareness to. Mark Ashela, in his book, calls one of the dimensions the temporal dimension, which is to say that integration is a process that happens over time and might continuously change. And I would wholeheartedly agree with that. However, in my opinion, there's always a risk to focus a little bit too strongly on the psychedelic experience as something that stands somehow apart from our everyday life. and as such needs to be integrated into it. And this is true, of course, in the sense that a non-ordinary experience is out of the ordinary. So there is this other thing that might feel separate from our normal life. I'm not challenging that. But what I do want to bring awareness to is that there's a risk to think about changing one's life purely in terms of when am I going to have the next psychedelic experience. So there's a risk, especially given what you just shared about this new hype, that we become obsessed with the medicine rather than with the process of healing that the medicine seeks to facilitate. And this is especially true for those of us that kind of keep coming back to the medicine, thinking that the way that we heal, that we learn, that we grow, or that we wake up spiritually is something solely or primarily done through psychedelics. And I don't mean to dismiss that some of us have a very serious commitment to the poison path, to a shamanic way of being in the world, which may or may not be deeply embedded in more indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world. But I do want to challenge that, or offer that I think for the vast majority of people in the West, I think it's better to conceptualize of psychedelics as either tools or practices or medicines that serve a particular purpose, and that they are not a purpose in their own right, if that makes sense. So to use mystical language, don't look at the finger because you'll miss the heavenly glory that it points to. Before we explore integration and continuation in more depth, I also want to remind you that the models and that the frameworks that I'll discuss are concepts, and so they serve a particular purpose. They help us do something. That's why we're talking about these things. But I really want to make sure that we don't mistake the way that we think or talk about HPPD as something that's making a definitive statement about reality. Or in other words, don't confuse the map for the terrain. So we should bring awareness to this discernment between there's a map, there's these diagnostical tools, or that these concepts or these frameworks that we use to talk about the reality that is incredibly complex. So don't mistake these two for each other. And this is especially important to make sure that we don't use our notions of what it means to be healthy, and I will be offering my very normative notions of what I think means to be healthy. There's always a risk of kind of using these models to either pathologize ourselves, or pathologize our friends, or pathologize our clients and their experiences. Like my dear colleague James Clifton often offers, it is easier to spot unhealthy or pathological behavior, or so-called pathology, but the question is, can you actually spot the health and the resilience and the complexity of what it means to be a human? So with that being said, let's take a look at the definition of integration that I've been using, and this is the moment that I want to have.
Use a clicker.
Yeah? All right. Wow, I did not listen to any of the advice that people give about PowerPoints. So I will read this for you as well, but there we go, it's a little better. There's still way too much information on all of the slides that are coming your way. You can integrate it when you're back home. So I currently understand integration to refer to all the processes of integrating different dimensions of the psychedelic journey. For example, its visions, its emotions, its insights, its thoughts, its sensations, its epistemic or spiritual or religious experiences. Maybe you encounter an entity, maybe yourself dissolves. Whatever it is, we're integrating that into the greater whole that is one's life. And as such, I think integration is part of psychedelic healing, or of the holotropic process, in that it supports a person to move towards greater, more integrated, or more harmonious wholeness. Now, there's no shared definition of integration, and Mark Aishala also points this out in his paper, and there's a couple of papers written about psychedelic integration, basically saying everyone's just doing something. So this is my definition, but I'm also just doing something to the best that I can. And Mark writes, the different definitions and meanings of the phrase to integrate all have something in common. Integration has to do with the formation of a whole from its parts, or the joining together of missing parts in order to make it complete. And he continues, another meaning is something or someone becoming part of a whole or a larger structure. And what I like is that it also pertains to someone becoming part of a larger structure. So it's not just internal integration and wholeness, it's also us becoming aware maybe of how deeply we are intertwined with the rest of reality. But what can be confusing is that in the lack of a consensus of what integration is and what it entails, we start to wonder what healthy integration actually looks like. And so we don't know when are we doing it right and when are we doing it wrong. And I want to go a little bit deeper into this because there's no rubric to assess, nor a diagnostic apparatus to conduct an integration triage. So what I'm about to offer to you should not be mistaken for that. I want to be very clear there. And listening to Marta and Ed today, I kind of wonder if we might actually need something like that, because it sounds to me when I'm listening to you that this comorbidity is a problem. We cannot really do a differentiating diagnosis. There's overlaps left, right, and center, and maybe we can just move away from that a little bit more and start to ask questions on how does this actually impact you, because that's what I'm hearing they do in the treatment. So maybe we need to reconceptualize post-psychedelic challenge and also post-psychedelic support. And related to this, and I'll kind of keep returning to this important point, there seems to be a lack of an underlying understanding of what it means to be well, or to be whole, or to be healthy. So our conversation in the first talk today, when we were kind of having a little discussion, it shows this quite clearly. We all might hold different perspectives of why we go tripping. Is it to break down the ego and to get like this non-dual state of mind? Or is it because we're cleaning up this trauma? Or is it because we want to have fun, and that's healing in its own right, and we want to be with community? And then to bring in that we have a quite narrow-minded, or often in the West, quite self-centered way of thinking about what constitutes the goal of psychedelic exploration, rooted in therapy, and much less so rooted in a deep ecology of a forest that is alive and is trying to communicate with us. So it is quite common when we don't formulate what we think is health or unhealthy, that the desirable goals and outcomes of an integration process are kind of implicitly rooted in psychotherapeutic or in shamanic approaches that are being used in the ceremony itself. And that can become a problem. I'm going to say this differently. What successful or problematic integration looks like is often defined by using the language and the models of a particular psychotherapeutic school or even a shamanic worldview. So are we talking about uncovered traumatic memories? Are we talking about a demonic possession? Are we talking about stuck prana or chi? Are we talking about experiential avoidance? Are we talking about an over-aroused central nervous system that requires polyvagal tuning? So we need to ask these questions, because otherwise we don't really have a compass, we don't have a North Star on how we're navigating the challenging terrain of integration. And to the point that I think Camille also made earlier, do we perceive of healing as an individual endeavor, kind of pertaining to personal traumas, or do we consider it a relational journey, awakening to our interdependent nature and our sense of common humanity? And it might be clear where my inclinations lie. without an explicit underlying understanding of what it means to be healthy, and by extension of what we mean by healing or wholesome integration, it is more difficult to formulate what integration is, or why and how we are offering integration support, and what forms and shapes that support should take. Or from the perspective of taking a psychedelic yourself, if you don't really know what it means for you to be healthy, you might actually end up taking on board what someone else tells you what healthy is. Or reproduce a very neoliberal notion that healing, of healing that has seeped into psychedelic culture, that has seeped into psychedelic therapy, and that has even seeped into a lot of our spirituality, becomes something that I do for myself. And this, I personally believe, is why it is so important to find a guide or to work with an integration professional that speaks the sort of same existential language as you do, that you consent to being challenged by, so that there's an attunement between the two of you. And I would even caution, and I hope this is not misconstrued, working with someone that you might kind of romanticize, like a Tibetan Lama, or an indigenous shaman from the rainforest. And I'm not saying that there's not profound wisdom present in those people. Don't get me wrong. The question is, do they have the capacity to translate their wisdom to your cultural and direct relational environment? And if they can't, because some of them are incredibly adept at doing this, but if they can't, they might not be the best pick for you. So this is something to continuously think about. And I wanna deepen this a little bit, because I actually sometimes wonder if shamanic practitioners, which in the West I think is primarily white people, so I'm not primarily talking about indigenous people here, a lot of shamanic practitioners and mainstream psychologists and psychiatrists I don't think are immediately suitable for doing this work of offering integration support. That is to say, a lot of shamanic models aren't translated well to a Western context and introduce a worldview that might actually complicate the integration process further. And in our Western context, on the other hand, a lot of psychiatric and therapy models heavily pathologize patients while lacking any clue or map or understanding of the extensive spiritual, mystical, and non-ordinary landscapes that can be traversed during psychedelic journeys. So we find ourselves a little bit in a pickle, and I think it's important that as a community we start to rethink what it means to do integration. And this is really where I agree with Mark, in that ideally we get to a point where integration is not something we need because everyone understands what psychedelics are. And it's like, oh, you come back from a psychedelic journey? Nah, I got you, I'm cooking tonight. It's that simple. It's like, oh, I get where you are. But we lack that. So if anything, I hope you walk away today with starting to think about what it means to actually integrate psychedelics into our society and culture. So in a moment, I'm going to finally introduce what I think about healing and integration. There's a lot of preface here.
It's on brand.
It's very on brand. I can just hear my mom go like, oh my God. Yeah. Nothing new here. Anyway, so the understanding of integration I'm going to offer to you, I think this is community, you know, my family is here. It's an understanding that is rooted in my own process. It's also embedded in a web of connections to other professionals in the wider field, some of them here. It's based on some of the clinical best practices in the 2 books I mentioned. It's also informed by Buddhist practice, non-duality, integral theory. It's steeped in about 5 years of intensive practice and study of psychedelic care. And it's coexisting with my queer, post-capitalist, weird, neuroatypical, and white embodiments. And I say all of that so that I'm incredibly transparent about this is just how I think about this. So you can take it or leave it. But what is going to come your way is a very normative way of what I think integration should entail. I'm not making truth claims and just say that this is how I think it should be done. And what I will offer is this sort of well, it says here simple overview, but it's a very, you heard me talk now. It's an overview of the different dimensions of psychedelic integration and what wholesome and challenging integration can look like. And at the heart of a wholesome integration process, I think we find acceptance, compassion, empowerment, and coherence. And I put it like that, so you have a fancy acronym called CAKE. By coherence, I mean that our experience, our psychedelic experience, and the insights are in line with, or are coherent with, how we live and with whom we live. We feel empowered to make behavioral changes and to embody insights. We understand the meaning of our journey and of our experience, and we are open to having that meaning continuously unfold into the future. We accept emotions that arise, and we're curious about the unfolding of them. And we might feel compassion for ourselves and for others. We sleep well, and although our sleep patterns might have been much different than before the experience, our dreams are often lucid, and we tend to wake up feeling well rested. So we're at ease in our community, in our bodies, we feel resourced, and this is really where my normative element comes in. We're resourced enough to engage and face the mess that we are in as humans, with courage, with resilience, and with creativity, and in a manner that reflects our unique talents. Now, as I said, if we think of psychedelic integration as a spectrum, with on the one hand this sort of very wholesome and easeful integration that I just described, we find very challenging integration on the other. So here we might see an inverse image. There's an acute lack of coherence between the psychedelic experience and everyday life. It feels like they're two radically different things. And whether what one might have felt ecstatic or profoundly disturbed during the psychedelic experience, everyday life seems not to harbor a sense of safety and stability to actually start integrating what has happened. And I say whether it's ecstatic or disturbing, because there's people that come from the warm bath of community that have this blissful experience, and they come home to a very cranky partner that is primarily worried that do you still love me? And that's their main concern. And then they go to work to a manager that doesn't understand what's going on with them. And then they're in a job that they don't like. So even when you have this beautiful psychedelic experience, integration can be challenging because there's no sense of stability and safety in your everyday life to actually bring it in and start to work with it. And thus you might need some support. Now let me immediately also say that inequity, racism, sexism, and other forms of narrow-mindedness or ignorance or violence or discrimination often inform how safe everyday life actually is and how safe we perceive it to be. So especially if you're working with clients, it's very important to take these systemic elements into consideration. And then there's other telltale signs of challenging integration. Someone might be confused about what happened, or the meaning someone attributes to the experience could almost feel rigid and kind of closed off. I took this experience and I worked through my trauma. Okay. It sounds like a story that almost bears very little resemblance to how someone is actually showing up in everyday life. Someone could also be emotionally volatile or completely numb and dissociated. Some people experience continuing effects. Some of those might be signs of a deep spiritual emergence or even an emergency. Sometimes these are signs of a drug-induced psychosis. And there's very little ways of thinking about this that can healthily discern between the two at the moment. This is another area where we really need more understanding of what is spiritual emergence and what is drug-induced psychosis. Some people might make important and impactful life decisions very impulsively, on a whim, while laughing that they've never felt so free, leaving their partner and kids, selling a portfolio of crypto coins, or quitting a job without any plans or savings. Now, for some people that might feel liberating, but one can ask, is there risk and harm involved for them and people around them? Other people might not be able to relax and sleep. Their thoughts are racing and their bodies are in a constant state of stress. This is what Marta talked about today. And finally, we can find challenges in the spiritual or existential dimension, where an ontological shock could cause a rift between everything someone thought they knew about reality and the implications of a worldview shattering psychedelic journey. And I think, I'm not sure who it was, but someone mentioned this earlier. What if everything is purely consciousness and we are all just vibrating fields of consciousness, patterns intricately woven into individual experiences of me and I? Or the inverse. Someone starts to talk like a guru or a spiritual teacher, is not attuned to others, and they're refusing to do the laundry and the dishes. All of this is to say that it's very common to feel challenged during the integration process. And as such, it's very normal to seek support. In fact, if there's anything that I hope you take home from this talk, is that psychedelic medicine, and thus the psychedelic integration process, is deeply relational. As such, psychedelic integration pertains to our relation to ourselves, to other humans, and to the more than human world and the very wild ecologies that we inhabit. Or to quote Ram Dass, we are all walking each other home. So perceiving of integration as a spectrum, it can help us normalize the richness of psychedelic experiences and their integration process. Integration, I believe, is fluid and complex, covering different dimensions of life. And being open to the many ways that this process can unfold and being curious about the personal and intimate nature of it can help us move away from pathologizing the more challenging aspects. Of course, we need to keep an eye out for potential harmful situations, but taking a community-centered and harm reduction approach, informed by a holistic view of health and well-being, can kind of ease the constraints of diagnostic language that often pathologizes a range of very normal reactions and responses to pretty overwhelming psychedelic experiences. And I feel we need to remain somewhat humble when we're discussing what we think actually constitutes a healthy response. Because of course you're going to be afraid for a couple of days on end if you just spent eternity looking into the void and realizing there's no meaning there. I think that's a very healthy response. So we need to rethink what it means to come back from an intense psychedelic experience, whether it's been deeply traumatizing or profoundly healing and transformative. I think it's mainly up to me or you or you or you or us as a community or for our clients to identify for ourselves where we kind of struggle in the integration process and let that lead where we're taking it. And we need to understand for ourselves what health looks like. So if you're going to see, for example, there's going to be one slide that says that in the behavioral dimension, you might feel, one of the things that I say is could be a telltale sign of a challenging integration is if there's some rigidity to acute changes in everyday life. If you're on the spectrum like me, it might actually be very normal that you kind of tense up a little if your everyday routine is a little messed up. So I want to make sure that when we're going to go over these different dimensions, that we don't see them as definitive statements about whether or not you're healthy or challenged in any way. So it's about how do I perceive of what is healthy or challenging within this wider process. Now, engaging psychedelic integration in community, I think, fosters vulnerability and builds resilience. And I think these two are skills that are best thought of as relational qualities. Our capacity to trust others and to healthily lean on them when we need to. And spirituality, if it doesn't want to fall prey to bypassing, I think should keep us feel comfortable or help us become more comfortable with our humanness, with our messiness. and compassionate and understanding and kind towards others. Seeing the diversity of lives, ups and downs and all arounds in ourselves and in each other, if we're engaging in collective integration, if you will, kind of normalizes the very vast landscape that we call the human experience, removing the idea that certain parts or experiences are bad or broken or somehow wrong. Likewise, I think it is paramount to understand that a challenging integration process, one that could be filled with fear and grief and sorrow, can actually lead to profound growth. It can lead to increases in compassion and increases in our creative powers. So wholesome and challenging integration are not equivalents or synonyms for right or wrong or for good or bad integration. And I want to end this part with a quote by Martin Prechtel, who writes in his book on grief and praise. Grief expressed out loud for someone we have lost, or a country or home we have lost, is in itself the greatest praise we could ever give them. Grief is praise because it is the natural way love honors what it misses. So allowing ourselves and each other to naturally move through very human, very basic human challenges that we encounter in everyday life, while we're being supported and while we're being seen in our joy and in our pain, we can actually become resilient and start to face the crisis of our time in a way that is aligned with our potential. So I'm going to pause here. If you need to stand up and shake for a moment, please do so. And then we're going to continue with the rest. Just do so. It's 6:15, and I have no clue how long the next part is going to take. We might be here until 9. The store closes at 10, so we'll be good. The reason I say this is because what we're going to do is we're going to look at each dimension, and my proposal is that if you have questions about something that's on the slide, that I elaborate. But as you might have noticed, I can elaborate extensively on one word for hours. So it might be nicer. Some of the people that know me are like, it's not a joke. I'm happy to kind of like start with the definition. So, and then the next slides are going to look like this: what wholesome integration looks like, according to me, not according to anyone else. And then what challenging integration might look like. So there's different ways I can just literally read with you what's on here, or you can ask questions, or if anyone is like, hey, I've had an experience like that, can we talk about that? Or if you have a case study from a client you worked with, if you can keep that anonymous, then I'm happy to kind of like explore that as well. So whatever seems most appropriate. Yeah.
We start with the relational.
Yeah, we can actually. There we go. So this is how I think about it. Relational integration pertains to relationships with significant others, with family and friends, with professional relationships, with the culture at large, wider ecologies and community. And so I give you a couple of hows. You might do that yourself. So you might want to start engaging nonviolent communication or circling as a way to foster authentic relating. Conscious relating, authentic relating. You might want to start reading about attachment theory, for example, or attend one of Ben's talks on how one can feel safe and secure while dating, sometimes even multiple people at the same time. But also, I think, and this is really where my normative part is, by engaging in civic engagement, by doing activism or volunteering, by going to community gatherings like this, and going to integration circles. And on almost every slide there's nature, because I think that we have a natural tendency to feel what is important if we're in the environment that I think we belong in. If you need additional or professional support, sometimes an integration coach cannot offer you support in every single dimension. That would be a lot to ask. You can consider going into relationship therapy or group therapy, or maybe you want to study eco-psychology and find an eco-psychologist that can help you feel more connected to nature, or you can engage in nature-based mindfulness. Now, I'm going to go over what wholesome integration looks like in concentric circles. So we're going to start with the self, but when I think about wholesome integration within this sphere, it is wholesome integration, wholesome relational integration within the self. So there's a relational coherence, and this is a concept that I really appreciate. I think Mark or Kyle writes about it as well, in which we might have these new experiences on the inside, but the moment we set step again in our usual social relations, they don't see the inside, they see the outside. So they might still approach you as if you haven't changed, even though you feel you've changed quite significantly. It might also be that because you step into such a familiar place, this especially happens with intimate partners and family and intimate friends, is that you suddenly notice that you're still doing the same thing as always, even though on the inside you're like, this is terrible, I feel really sad right now. So you get this weird dissonance and incoherence between how you actually feel and what you're showing. And the word persona comes from the Latin word for mask. So this is something to kind of like have in the back of our heads. It might also be that new identities are either not, in wholesome integration, your new identity is probably acknowledged by the people around you. So especially in indigenous communities, you might go through a rite de passage. Or if everyone knows that you're heavily addicted and you come back home and they see you're no longer using, they might actually acknowledge like, hey, we see that you stopped using. They celebrate the 1 month mark, the 1 year mark, etc. You had a question?
I don't know if I can ask now or if
yeah, please,
just yeah. Okay. No, it's just you were talking about the family and partners, that those people they do not recognize, or can happen when they recognize, they do not take so serious. And I think there is a very rigid culture. I think a lot of countries that people are not able to change, or if they change, they're someone else. Yeah. Oh, she changed, or someone else. But they don't see from the perspective we're here to evolve, to grow, and of course we're going to change. And normally those people are the ones that created those traumas and triggers, and they are going to trigger us to have those situations that we're going to be like very much triggered. And that's why we have the feeling that we did not change, but actually those are
so it's a very subtle process that you're pointing to, and it's challenging. And it's also important to realize if we make big changes that can be threatening to other people. Or I recently worked with a client who was changing very significantly, and it escalated with, I think, their flatmate or one of their best friends quite quickly. And at one point they kind of sat down to talk about it, and their best friend actually admitted, I'm jealous of you because I would like to change as well, and I'm not succeeding in it. And that's hard.
It's hard.
It can also be that a partner is afraid that if their partner is coming back, they no longer love you. This is something that we hear almost every retreat of 6-7 people.
It's about control, right?
It could be about control, but it can also just be that it's unknown. I don't know where you're going to this place where people dress in white, puke in buckets, sing songs, and then you're going to come back, and everyone talks about how this is a big transformation. That's a big thing for a partner, especially if they don't know. the best preparation, the best integration is preparation.
Yeah.
So one thing that we try to do is tell your partner what they can expect. Sometimes it's nice if you come back home, you can say, hey, I'm not ready to talk about this, but I want you to know I still love you. And I'm not going to do anything. Affirmation.
Yeah. Which type of language that's, having compassion towards your partner and so on.
And so this is also where balance between time for self and time with others comes in. It's like knowing, do I need to be in relation right now, or do I actually need to be with myself? And this is where we might want to find a healthy independence, that we feel safe and secure when we're alone. We can engage in self-care, we can engage in self-regulation. When we come back,
but it's very dependent indeed, and when we learn that, it's very powerful. And I think people around us, they can really feel threatened indeed.
And sometimes, I mean, my family's in the room, so I can be a bit more vulnerable. But I've come back from experiences, and afterwards we had big fights, and it was very hard for all of us. That's just me a bit, but sticking with it and working through it, and me not thinking, oh, they're just not understanding me, right? So it works both ways.
Exactly.
And that my internal perspective for a little while was just, I'm doing all the work and they are not doing anything, even though I was just fucking, Anyway, back to health. So wholesome integration and concentric circles in our direct relationships. So this is really family and stuff. So the question is, can we be vulnerable and attuned? This is really what I think is a sort of like key component of when we're wholesome. We experience interpersonal ease. I don't have to continuously think, am I doing this well? Is everything okay? There's weird tensions in the air. There's unspoken words. So I experience an interpersonal sense of ease wherever I go. This is also where healthy dependence comes in, because healthy independence can only exist with healthy dependence, which is I'm capable of asking for support, I can co-regulate, I can be held. This is what Marta was talking about as well. And I can ask for care when I actually need it. We're human beings, so we're not made to do everything by ourselves. Very often that's actually trauma, when we think that we should be able to do it. So healthy independence can only exist if we can also healthily depend on others. Again, my opinion. So take it with a grain of salt. It's also important that family and friends understand, they respect you, they support the process, and this is really where I think, to your point, where Ram Dass also comes in.
Yeah.
When one of his students kind of makes claims like, oh, I'm enlightened, he's like, go spend the weekend with your parents. Let's see how enlightened you really are. And I think he says this with a sense of love. It's really hard. It's hard to stay true to everyone and be compassionate and not get activated. It's hard. So, and so that's, again, compassion, kindness, and curiosity. They form the kind of like foundation of connection to others when you are dealing with people in your direct relationship.
I would like to just add something,
please.
because I think it's also important. I have seen it happen, and it has happened to me. That this is relational in the environment that you are, but also going a little bit in the generations previous to you, and understanding exactly. For example, my mom comes from here. We all carry a lot of traumas and different kind of things, and we're most of the times angry because our parents, the people that raised us, were not able to give the things that we needed. But then also trying to understand that part, that we are part of this whole thing. And okay, my father comes from here, my mother comes from here, and they come even from some other things, and that we have normalized violence, that we have normalized a lot of different things, and it's like, okay, it's really enlightening, and it's also like a relief to understand, and it really helps in the healing process to embrace the messiness. And I think that can alter in a healthier way, also to just how to relate to the other and how to just be yourself with that messiness.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you said, because then you have to change the lenses of being a daughter. Then you have to see your parents as human beings, and I think that's the compassion comes from.
Yeah.
They also have parents who your parents also have parents who also just did something, and they also have their traumas, and they really try their best to care for you the best they can, but still they make mistakes, like everyone.
It's endless. We have a lot of work to do. Then at the level of community, and this is kind of where after this I started to challenge people in the psychedelic community last fall. So as long as we're using this word community very broadly right now, I'm thinking about colleagues in professional relations, for example, at work, or people that you encounter in the supermarket, maybe. So there's wherever you interact with people from your community, they kind of understand and respect your process. Now, it's easy for me because I work here in Kokopelli, so whenever I came from, intense psychedelic experience, I could just go like, I'm gonna be downstairs for a moment. Could you take a look at this shop? And then that's kind of like, okay. But it can be challenging because after this, I worked in the Trimbos Institute, where it was kind of the opposite culture. Again, if we're talking about wholesome integration in your community, there's compassion, there's kindness, there's curiosity, and they kind of form the foundation of how you relate to those other people. You care for the people that are similar to you, and you experience yourself safety in community. And this is, again, I'm normative about this. I think it's healthy integration if you start to realize that there's particular people in your community that are being excluded or discriminated against, that you start to address this. And I dare say that if you don't, you're actually not really integrating well, according to me. And this is especially true if we look at oppressive power dynamics. And I think there's a lot of communities that kind of struggle with this, because as you just said, the psychedelic community is very enthusiastic until you bring up the topic of HPPD. And there's a lot of people that know firsthand that the psychedelic community is very, very inclusive, unless you're black. The psychedelic community is very, very open-minded, unless you're really queer.
Yeah.
So this is the place where I do think we need to start addressing what it means to feel safe in community in different, much deeper ways. Another point here is that there's this big question that a lot of hippies from the 60s and 70s, I think, turned out not to be right in that psychedelics would naturally make you a better person, or would naturally make you more empathic. I think that psychedelics have a unique and uncanny capacity to make us feel part of something bigger than us. But if there's a right-winged philosopher at the head of your cult, it might just be that your sense of connection to something bigger is organized around ethnocentric lines, or around lines of your gender, or your sex, or your race, or your whatever political party. And the epitome of this is the QAnon shaman storming the Capitol. He drank loads of ayahuasca. So if we, for a moment, think that psychedelics will somehow make you into a liberal, left-leaning hippie, that's not the case. And so the question is, and this is my personal challenge, like how far can you take your sense of interconnectedness? If it doesn't reach across the boundaries of what you're comfortable with, it's not really interconnection, right? It's more like, I choose to connect to you, but you're still rejecting probably also parts of yourself. Again, that's my understanding of this. But this is really where we get into a little bit more of the political side of relational integration. And that's why I think we need to start thinking about if we're getting along on this path, if we're getting along on this path, we're going to feel that compassion, kindness, and curiosity basically in relation to all other humans. We start to feel care for people who are radically different from us. And yes, that includes the Trump voter. And yes, that includes your very racist neighbor. And that's not easy. That's where it really gets fucking hard. But we're not going to get out of this shit if we don't know how to do this. And we're not going to get through to people that are thinking radically different than us if we cannot approach them with care and kindness and compassion. And this is also where I think civic engagement and social activism come in. And it doesn't really matter if you're going to join Extinction Rebellion or if you choose to keep your local parks free from cigarette butts, or you go to a beach to do a cleanup, or you're engaging in psychedelic community organizing work. Whatever your flavor is, maybe you want to design new billboards, do graffiti that promote, whatever. But just to engage in all these different ways in which we can really radically change the systems that we inhabit. And this is where I'm really post-capitalist. I like this. It's a hard slogan, but as long as some of us are in change, all of us are in change. Our wealth exists by virtue of millions of people on the other side of the planet suffering. We're on a planet that's fucking doomed. Sorry to get to this one, but the more than human world is not really doing great at the moment. And so again. I think if we're thinking about what wholesome integration looks like, and I want to emphasize, if you are deep in your own trauma, I don't think anyone expects you to also go to demonstrations and to give away 15% of your income, even though you can barely afford food in the end of the week. This might not be there. We're talking about what does it look like to slowly expand your concentric circles of compassion and kindness and care. But I do think it should also include the more than human world, where we start to feel this connection to everything that is living, that we feel care for living sentient beings, that we engage in civic and social activism that also protects our ecologies, that we feel deep care for the environment. And another part might actually be, and I want to go back to that quote earlier from Martin Prestel about about grief, that a lot of us are currently experiencing climate grief, and many of us are not even aware of the fact that that's what we're actually feeling. There's massive ecological collapse, there's economic disparities, there's all sorts of very serious problems. And I think it's very important that we don't individualize them. Don't pretend that, oh, you're just depressed and here's your antidepressant. No, your situation is that you live in a hyper-capitalist neoliberal world and you're being exploited right now. And I think we need to become more comfortable with actually bringing, and now I'm talking more to the professionals, bringing some of this language into the way that we do integration support. Which of course doesn't mean that someone can also be depressed and there might be individual or personal problems, but that we bring a little bit more of that discernment in what is actually going on here. And again, to remind ourselves, instead of pathologizing all sorts of mental health problems, normalizing that if you live in an ecosystem that is on the verge of collapse, maybe your anxiety makes a lot of sense and we don't have to treat it. Sorry, I get fired up.
No, that's good, but I think it's also more than mental health, it's also political views. Like,
absolutely.
How I view racism, even though I haven't really talked about dire racist or people, like, I don't know, but it's like also that's just a part or a consequence of this hyper-capitalist neoliberalism where everybody gets exploited. And like then people come from a place of like privilege and point the finger to that, but in the end they also just feel like they're getting exploited. Or the Trump supporter that's also just, what the fuck is this paradigm we're living in? I want some change, right? It's the elite to make all the choices. And it's like when you approach someone for that mindset, and it's like, yeah, it wasn't as much different as me, you just came to a different conclusion.
for me comes to mind is also this Krishnamurti quote: "It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society."
Yeah.
And it's also this like depression effects that people get actually, or this realization, derealization. So there's something wrong with you. It's actually realize the truth of the world you live in. It's pretty fucked up. Like a neo scene in Zion, when you realize, oh, it's not like buildings anymore. It's just like this whole different society that's downgraded in a way, but it's more true to itself. Yeah.
And the inverse is also true, which is sometimes we make it about the ecological collapse and about fighting, the police, and actually I'm just still dealing with some teenage angst in my own, antagonistic personality. It's like, okay, maybe I should look at that. So to really bring discernment to this process and to be compassionate with ourselves in order to actually work through a lot of this stuff. Did you have another?
Yeah, I just want to add into what you're saying, because indeed, I think the detachment from others, I think it's very powerful as well. When we learn that we don't have the control over people, that everyone has your own pace, as your own development, I think it can set you free a little bit as well. And being respectful and understand that we cannot impose things to people as well. So I think everyone has their own pace of learning about evolving and so on and so forth. And I think also this is very important. Yeah.
So how does it look like when your relational integration is challenged? I think the first thing is that there's relational incoherence. So your internal experience does not match how you're coming across, what your persona is. New identities might not be acknowledged, or you might actually receive the feedback, you didn't have a religious experience, you just took drugs and got high. You might find that you find it very challenging to actually set enough time for yourself and spend enough time with others. For some people, it's very difficult to get out of the house and to make contact. For other people, it's very difficult to set boundaries and stay in the house. You might experience interpersonal conflict, or, and this is quite common, amplified attachment wounding after a psychedelic experience, where you're, instead of feeling more securely attached to someone else, you're actually more anxious. You're even more avoidant than usual. And your partner might, get the full laugh.
Full layer.
The brunt of your dysregulated nervous system and your kind of like panic that comes from your experience. This is especially true for people that also struggle with complex trauma or PTSD, including people that actually got PTSD because of their psychedelic use. This is also where we might see unhealthy independence. I'm not asking for help because I don't trust other people. There's an over-reliance on self-regulation at the cost of just, asking for a hug or, feeling that you're part and parcel of the community. There's a sort of myth of independence that's the most important, that's the hallmark of health, is that I can take care of myself. And there's a lot of spiritual bypassing because I now saw that everything is non-dual, so there's no more need for me to rely on anything else than just consciousness in and of itself. Because it's all just, changes within consciousness. So there can be actually spiritual bypassing going on when we're looking at relational integration. What you would see is that someone is kind of protected, not attuned to other people, might be really self-absorbed, living in a sort of self-centered way, my life, my practice, and maybe kind of like small connections. So self, loved ones, the in-group, might be a spiritual community, might be a political community, but nothing outside of that. And again, I really want to make sure that being self-centered in certain parts in your healing process can be profoundly wise and compassionate. It can be very healthy to take care of yourself, to spend a lot of time on yourself. So if it feels like an assignment to engage in all these big concentric circles, but it immediately feels overwhelming, maybe that's a sign that you have some more resourcing to do, and it's very hard to feel that resource and to engage.
Especially people that feel really responsible.
Yes, thank you.
To be like, no, it's selfish, I can't, I should, like whatever bit of energy I have, I should put towards.
Yeah. This is
a hard one.
This is a hard one. Yeah. I just come from a burnout, so this is something that I needed to learn the hard way. Other forms of challenging relational integration: your family and your friends don't understand. Your colleagues and professional relations don't get why you're late and are not going to give you another day off because we have a deadline. You might not even have the time and space to ask off from work. So I work with quite some clients, come to a 5-day retreat, and then literally the day after, they're going to be in a different time zone, and they need to go back to work. And I'm like, what? So we recommend not to do that. But again, we live in a system that might, force you to do that. Otherwise, you're not going to have food in the end. I think that if you only care for people who are similar and not for people who are different, that your integration is that some of the insights might not be penetrating as deep as they could. You might feel a lack of care of the environment. I think that the moment you experience the environment as you're going to relate to it radically differently. Fear, distrust, and assumptions or prejudice might form the foundation of your connection to others, including the more than human world. And there might be an avoidance of political or civic engagement. For example, the spiritual bypass version of this is, I don't want any bad vibes. We only do high vibration. And you're kind of bringing me down with your climate change. So another one, which comes from privilege blindness, it's not that bad. Look at us.
We're fine.
We're fine. Yeah, there's some people south of the Netherlands maybe that are less well off, but it's not that bad. And empathy fatigue is a big one here too, to your point. It's like when we feel that we're continuously drained, that's a very good sign that you're actually giving too much. You might be working on a very big concentric circle where as actually you need to be a little bit more here.
Daan?
Yes.
What I'm missing is that for some people, integration can be about strictly personal matter.
Yes.
Strictly a personal trauma that can
Yes.
work through.
Yeah.
And then having you as an integration counselor making their diploma dependent on their societal, empathy, relevance, may make the bar too high.
Yeah.
Can you reflect on that?
So I want to honor what you're saying, and this is the very long preface I gave to everything I'm saying now. Is one, I'm not giving someone a diploma that they're now healthy or not. Right? I'm following the client and where they want to go. So if they come in and they want to work on this trauma that has been coming up or that they've been trying to address, I'm not going to go like, you want to talk about your trauma, but I have something else in mind for you. We're going to talk about racism today. That's not how I would ever work. More to the point of what you're saying, and this is really why I'm kind of like driving home, I think, 2 points. One, I would never do that with an individual client if they are not ready to actually start thinking about some of these things.
So that's sensitive.
So it's a very sensitive, idiosyncratic, personal process that happens in deep attunement. But the other thing is, if you want to work with me, in the beginning, I will be very transparent about the fact that this is my understanding of what it means to be healthy. And this is one dimension, right? There are 6 more dimensions that have very little to do with civic engagement. So there are 6 other dimensions that I'm interested in. One is not more important than the other, but so we're highlighting out one dimension right now and different dimensions within that dimension. But it's one part. But I will be frank, like this is part of me. I cannot leave this at home. If I hear, and I've worked with clients that, they're talking about how much compassion they feel, but how annoyed they were by the black cashier checking out their food. And that will make me pause and offer a critical reflection, like, hey, what did you just say? And I'm going to be curious about it, because I genuinely want to understand why does a black cashier annoy you? Why do you even have to mention she's black? Like, let's start there. This is a real example, so I'm not making this up. Let's start there. And to slowly unpack that often actually reveals deep personal discomfort pertaining to the trauma. So it's entangled in different ways that are very difficult to disentangle. That's why I'm saying this is a model. It's not reflective of how actual integration support would look like. And I would never introduce this when someone is saying, I'm super activated, I can't sleep, I'm like, all my traumas flooding back in. What do I do? Let's talk about racism. That's not, Does it make sense?
A little more, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you're in a position of extreme confidence or extreme, there isn't a vulnerable situation.
Yeah, I agree.
There's all these expectations that the therapist, basically, which your position is therapist life. There's all these expectations that you have about the final end of the process for that person.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that whenever we're holding a place of power, I think it starts with being very transparent about it. And that's why I'm saying, if you work with me, this is what you're going to get. And if you don't want that, work with someone else. Right? That's the first thing I can do. Second thing is, I work in a client-centered way. So this is informing me in the back of my mind, and I check, do I have actual consent to make certain reflections or not? Is someone ready for that? I can also mess that up. But finally, and I think this is something that I'm trying to figure out right now in this period in my life, I think remaining politically neutral is not neutral. So, and I think that's a real problem. I went to a therapist and I talked about my climate grief, and my therapist didn't want to make a political statement and so refocus on how that felt for me, which helped me. So I don't want to discount it. It helped me to talk about that feeling. But she couldn't, she felt very uncomfortable actually working with the climate grief itself. And actually acknowledging, just saying, like, it is difficult to see that we're in the 6th mass extinction. That is hard to see. She couldn't say that, which is something that would have been profoundly healing for me, to just have my normal emotion normalized rather than pathologized, and something to be now dissected in therapy, in which we're going to explore why problem. It's my problem. No, it's not my problem. It's our problem. Does it make sense when I say this?
It does, but it's not per se the problem of the person coming to you for a psychedelic integration.
That kind of depends, because there's a lot of people that actually struggle. One of the things that some people need help with is that they say, there's such profound sadness and I don't know where it comes from. Have I been abused? They come up with all these stories. We can actually go to this one, cognitive integration. So this is about the thoughts, but also the meaning we give to our own experience. And we'll circle back to emotions in a moment, but there's a lot of people that the first 1, 2, maybe 3 experiences tend to be very joyful, tend to be very heart-opening, tend to put them in touch with a sort of like new sense of trust in reality. It is okay, I'm safe. Doesn't always happen. This is something that I've noticed over time working with a lot of people. Very often, when people are a little bit more grounded in that, the psychedelic experiences tend to start to deepen. and start to dredge up all sorts of personal stuff. But a lot of people, especially when they're exploring higher doses of psychedelics, break through the personal suffering, the personal grief, the personal loss, the personal challenges.
They get to transpersonal.
And they get into a transpersonal place where they start to experience suffering as a human quality.
Collective.
Or collective trauma, or intergenerational trauma. Or they start to see these scenes of world wars and of rape and of pillaging and of nature being destroyed. And if they come back from that, I think it's very appropriate to acknowledge it is normal to feel all those things because you are a human. And I'm not going to pathologize that.
I totally
Okay,
agree.
good.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. But is it okay for you to say you're suffering climate grief?
That depends. I wouldn't just, off the bat, just straight like, oh, that's climate. No. In fact, but if someone consistently keeps coming back, it hurts me so much to see those trees being cut down. I might at one point offer, have you heard of climate grief? I might give a definition and then ask, how does it land with you? No, that's nothing, that's not it. Okay, then we put it back in the toolkit. It's not the right tool for now. If someone says, wow, that makes sense. That was my experience when I heard it for the first time. I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. Yeah, I've been there.
But the open-handed offering is really important.
Yeah, I like to work in not too directive ways, client-centered ways.
Yeah.
But I'm informed by all of this. This is in the back of my mind.
So thank you, because
Okay.
it raised a lot of questions.
Yeah, no, I get that,
I hope I haven't taken too much time.
I don't know. I find it fascinating, but I'm so sorry for the rest.
It's quite important because most of the times in therapy happens dismissal. It's like, okay, I understand what you have, but you're here because you're depressed, not because you have bulimia as well. That happened to me, and it was like, okay. So I just go and throw out more. What? And then it's like a little bit like the system, how the system is built. Okay, I have these codes, and you are in these codes. So if you want to go to through other things, so it's like to recognize, okay, there is this here. You feel like, as you just said, I connect with you, maybe you are not interested in this, but here you have it, just if you want to be informed. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are more things than the DSM or another manuals that we studied in universities.
Thank you. Anyone else that wants to? Yeah, please go
I
ahead.
think if you make it broader, like I even think it can actually make people more sick if you keep focusing on it's their problem. Like literally making them more sick and taking the energy out of putting it out in the world and actually creating a little bit of change. I think actually that, I don't know. I have very strong opinion about this.
I do too, as you might have noticed. Anyone else that wants to comment on this or? No? In that case, let's go back to cognitive integration. So this really pertains to kind of mental states, thoughts, the meaning that we give, the sense of purpose that we get from the experience, the sort of narrative we tell about the experience. It's about self-acceptance, but more on a cognitive level rather than sort of like self-acceptance on an emotional level. And it's about the sort of cognitive understanding that we have of what happened. And this can include basic psychoeducation. Did you know that it's normal for your feelings to be amplified? Maybe you're not really that sad about something. Maybe it was an amplification, or maybe, anyway. So could be just normalizing what people are, offering as what they're struggling with. If you want to do this yourself, journaling, storytelling, writing your autobiography, reading and being in nature can really be ways of kind of like digesting. In Dutch, I hate this term, but het een plekje geven. To give something a place, like to have an understanding of how does this fit into the wider context of my life. And then if you seek additional professional support, CBT or psychotherapy or spiritual care might really work here. If this is all going well, I think that the core is that your experience makes sense, or to use Mark Aishala's words, there's an internal coherence between the experience and between life. Does that make sense, or does this require more explanation? Okay, so the narrative is coherent and has continuity, so the experience and story we tell about it doesn't form a break. But also, and this is quite important from a spiritual care perspective, meaning is flexible and open-ended, which is to say, it changes. I had a very difficult experience when I was, I think, 17 or 18 years old, and every time I tell the story, I get new little nuggets, and it's kind of like still unfolding. So a recent meaning it got is that it's a great example of this, which is a little meta, but now another thing is that experiences might be revisited and new perspectives might be gained, which includes something that used to be like, oh, that was very good, might suddenly come like, oh, that wasn't actually that, that was actually, it was really fucked up that I experienced that. And insights might be recovered. And also, as I said, there's a self-acceptance, there's a sort of like ownership. I went to the ceremony, this, you know, I'm okay with what happened. On a sort of cognitive level, it makes sense. It can become challenging when the experience doesn't make sense. Like I had an out-of-body experience, or I was crying nonstop, or there's no internal, there was no internal sense of self anymore. I became one with everything. If you don't have a framework to understand that, that can be profoundly difficult. It's 7 o'clock. They didn't deal with that, no, but I did just see it 7 o'clock.
It's probably, I would say, max 15 minutes.
I mean, it's not going to work in 15 minutes, but I'm happy to give it a go. No, I'm just saying, like, if anyone needs to leave, or you're dead hungry, or you're getting bored of me, please just do your thing. I wanted to make a moment.
I just want you to know this is the third reason that we're leaving. Love you.
Maybe it's fruitful if I just show the slides, and if you have questions about anything on the slide, you can just ask.
Yeah. Otherwise, we will stay here the whole night.
And otherwise, we'll just stay here the whole night.
It would be fine by me, but.
I think I'm going to touch on some things that are happening here in the bottom. So it can happen that after we had a very big experience that we start to feel paranoia, or we feel grandiosity. I've had massive ego inflation in 2 days after an ayahuasca experience. During the experience, I had a quite genuine spiritual experience, but I'm not sure who mentioned this earlier. Quite quickly, my ego was like, I'm the Buddha of the lowlands, here we go. And people were bowing to me. In reality, they were hunching over because they were vomiting. My experience, they were bowing to me. And it took me a decent 1 to 2 days before I realized that that was not what was actually going on. This part was funny. The unfunny thing was that I now realized what had happened, and that felt actually really scary to me, because I lost connection to reality. I no longer realized I was just being grandiose. It was just a part of me that was so amplified and actually so scared of that spiritual experience, because for a moment this sense of self didn't exist anymore, that it just needed to make itself really, really big and inflate itself. And it took me a year of working with my Buddhist teacher to really move through some of the identification with the experience that I had. So even though some of these things might really piss other people off, because it's yucky when someone comes in ego inflated, but actually underneath very often there's a very deep vulnerability that we might want to actually invite someone to slowly start to explore. In the same way, paranoia can occur, It's quite common for people during an experience to suddenly think they've been poisoned, they're in a dark cult, they're in they're having a real-life allergic reaction. Their partner, we once had a retreat, their partner, he was sure his partner was cheating on him at that moment because he had a vision. And so he wanted to call his partner, and we said, it doesn't sound like the best idea when you're tripping to call your partner to confront them with the supposed cheating. And it turned out not to have happened afterwards. So there's all these things that can happen, and when someone presents with more psychotic symptoms, I mentioned spiritual emergence earlier, I do think it is important in some of these cases to actually look for more professional support. There's no shame in that. There's a lot of people that are psychedelically informed. There's a lot of really good psychiatrists that actually know when to give medication and when not to give medication. And so I also think that, speaking as an integration professional, that we can also lower the bar for people to actually seek professional help, because there's a lot of shame and taboo around that, especially in some spiritual scenes that keep emphasizing how bad mainstream mental health care is. Yes, and there's also some nuggets where you might actually get a lot of help and grounding. And you also already touched on depersonalization, derealization, so I'm not going to go there. Emotional, basically everything that pertains to your emotion is about emotional integration. Things that you could do are, this is one of my favorites, actually listening to music that you listen to during the ceremony can really be provocative, help you kind of move through emotions a little bit more, and very often people start to notice that the emotional intensity starts to fade after a couple of times revisiting something. Is there anything on here that you want to ask, challenge? No? You had a question earlier, sorry.
I forgot my word. Yeah, like, I'm just really curious what helped ground you from like the ego inflation. And I think it took an entire year, of course. But.
In a nutshell, one, I had a very kind Buddhist teacher, still have, very kind Buddhist teacher that acknowledged the opening. And I think his first joke was, and this is the reason some Zen students are hit with a stick afterwards. Don't forget, you're very human. And so that was one part. It was also the start that I realized I need therapy. Yeah. And so this is about 10 years ago. And then we had some fights in the family that were a lot of fun afterwards. And those two, I think, in hindsight, were needed in order to push shit to the surface and start to deal with it.
Yeah, well, because I was thinking intuitively, I thought like, yeah, connecting back to like your own name, the name your parents gave you, those roots, and probably helps not to inflate your ego as much, or like same through the Buddha, because you're just still this little human baby that came out of that.
I'm not sure if anything would have helped me in the first 1 or 2 days.
No, I get it.
Because I was really out of it. Yeah. And it actually took my Buddhist teacher, who I deeply trusted, to pop the bubble and go like, we have a problem. He was the first person that I would listen to, especially my.
Everybody who would say something like that.
Anything else around this? So wholesome emotional integration. I think the core is this, that you're open to experiencing all your emotions, and as they arise, including in some of the volatility and sensitivity that is common after an experience, but you don't become too identified with it or with them. Here's a piece that sometimes people are worried that if they suppress or compartmentalize because they need to go to work, that they're somehow doing integration wrong. And I think it actually speaks to the capacity to attune yourself to an environment and what is needed in that particular environment, as long as when you come home, you can kind of like, okay, and then actually make space to process everything that you might have felt. Also, the absence of depression and severe anxiety are probably signs that you're having quite a wholesome integration. If those are actually present, very often you're gonna need more support. So when is it challenging? Well, first of all, when you're dissociating, avoiding, numbing, repressing, or doing anything not to really feel the process, and that could also become emotionally volatile, sort of like one emotion after the next, because what that means is you don't actually have time to sink in and actually process it. It's just one thing after the other. So if it becomes too difficult to stay with emotions, this is also a moment you might want to look for support, including just being held by someone else and just co-regulating a little bit. Another one is, and this is a story that I've heard quite often in my private practice, I really regret that I took that psychedelic. Now, it's not a judgment. I'm not saying that's wrong and so you're unhealthy, but it does point to something that has happened, and feeling the regret, like, oh, I wish I hadn't, but there's no shame involved anymore, or there's no self-judgment involved anymore, I would say could be a healthy form of integration. So you could still say, you know, if I could choose, I would go back and not have that experience. I had that for a couple of years with the big Buddha opening. I was like, man, if I could just go back, I wouldn't, because it brought so much shit up. Now I'm like, I'm actually grateful that I had it. It's not for everyone though, and that took about 8 years for me to get to that point of quite intensive psychotherapy, working with a Buddhist teacher, having really good friends that speak truth. So, yeah. Continue. Somatic. Again, all of these dimensions are difficult to separate in real life, but this pertains to all the physical sensations and the felt senses, but also, and you touched on this quite a lot, and Marta as well, on how well do we digest, how well do we sleep, how well do we relax. And there's a couple of different exercises you can do yourself to kind of like regulate your body. There's also additional support you could look for, somatic-oriented psychotherapy. This wonderful man right here is a trained somatic-oriented psychotherapist, or in becoming. Basically, in the end phase. You can. Some people don't have a friend or a lover that they trust or partner, and there are forms of non-touch co-regulation with a securely attached professional. And there's also forms of body touch coming from body workers that can help you co-regulate, where your nervous system actually allows itself to slow down a little. So if that's what you need, please look for it. Here's some signs that you might need that. Well, first of this dysregulated central nervous system, that's a beautiful conceptual tool, but how does it look like? Very often, it's people that are in very high energy, and there's a lot of it's the type of people that you're kind of talking to you, and you're starting to feel a little uncomfortable, you know, or they don't really finish their so that's exactly. Well, if you feel this, imagine what it's like if you're in that, and on the other side of the same spectrum, people that are completely numb and absent-minded, don't feel anything, could be derealization, depersonalization, could also just be they're in a fully dissociated state, kind of like going back and forth on the polyvagal ladder. That's a term that makes sense. Insomnia, difficulty to relax. These are all signs that you might be challenged in your integration. And HPPD, I mean, that's a purely somatic one. But also some people have flare-ups of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, or an autoimmune disorder in the wake of a psychedelic experience. Now, I can support you with your integration, but I have no clue how to deal with your autoimmune disorder. So seeking professional help for those things are important. Basically, if you feel at home and ease in your body, that's a good sign of wholesome integration. This is a very big one. We're gonna, we've talked about a lot of this. It's in its essence, is your psychedelic experience coherent with your worldview? Is there a space within your worldview to deal with it? And if there's not, are you okay with the anomalies, with the incoherence and agnosticism, the fact that you don't know what happened? If you're comfortable with that, there's no real big problem going on. I've had a couple of experiences with demonic entities that I'm not really sure if they're real or not, but I'm not bothered by them. I take them some way at face value. I'm not really sure. I'm open to the idea that maybe it's real, maybe it's not. It doesn't really matter to me. Not do justice to the experience, but I'm not uncomfortable with the fact that that's something that I experienced. So there's not complete ontological coherence, but I'm still kind of comfortable with some of this stuff. Another one is the capacity to hold complexity in multiple perspectives at the same time, and you can inverse that or juxtapose that to if you start to collapse complexity onto simplicity. There's quite some black and white thinking where people are really dead set on getting one very simplistic explanatory narrative that helps them understand what happened to them, because the complexity of not knowing it is just too much to bear. So that might be a cognitive thing, it might also become an existential or spiritual dimension. This is one that I think is quite, is there a laser on this thing? Maybe. No. Projecting your own inner healing capacity onto the shaman or facilitator. If you're extraordinary knowledge of the guide or on the medicine, and so they cannot heal themselves.
How would you as a facilitator react to that? Because quite often actually upstairs it happens that people put it all onto us, like, oh, you gave me this, you made me feel this, you... and although I think most of us know that we're not the people that created the epiphany, it's still sometimes difficult, like, you make it like very like, it wasn't me, like...
It kind of depends from situation to situation and how much time you have. If it's a noisy shop on a Friday night and you're trying to help 3 other people, you might just go like, you know, okay, I hear you, thank you. You know, sometimes it's actually they want to express gratitude to you, but they don't really know how, and so they make it about how you pick the right music. If you have a lot of time, I love what Peter Gesser said on the conference. He's like, sometimes my patients say that I am the most brilliant musician, and then I kind of shrug it off and say, yeah, I found a good playlist online. And so he kind of just doesn't make it any bigger.
Yeah.
I think that's the core of it. And just, hey, thank you for that compliment, but I also want to remind you, you did this.
Yeah, I often do with a little joke indeed, but I often wonder if that's the correct way of like, I think it's still you.
Well, I think one of the important things that you're noting is that you are aware internally that it was there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that actually believe what their client is saying. When their client says, oh my God, you healed me, they're like, I healed you? I am the Buddha of the lowlands. And finally, avoiding human messiness through spiritual practice. If you've not heard of the term spiritual bypassing, please look it up. It's a very big challenge. And this self-aggrandizing through spiritual or ego inflation is akin to what you're saying. So there's a lot of facilitators that get the message that they need to become, like there's people taking medicine that get the message, you need to become a shaman. You need to start surfing this medicine. Now, again, I don't want to discount that or dismiss it immediately, but I would have some follow-up questions. I would want to deepen that inquiry. Why is that? What is that motivation? And there's beautiful models to work with it, like Jung's wounded healer. There's all these really beautiful ways of understanding some of this. We went through this. We have behavioral. That's basically, can you start new behaviors? Easiest part. And if you can't, you have a problem. And then there's the good. Did you want to know more? It's like 7:20 now. So and then there's creative. I'm going to send you the slides. Yeah. So I'll just ask one more time if there's any questions. And don't ask what's behavioral.
I think the last one is a quite important one, because there are a lot of people who cannot talk about their experiences. So you can give them some stuff to use the creative way.
So what I like about creative integration is that we can, when people struggle to articulate or not just talk about it or even draw it, there's a lot of traditions in which you're not allowed to talk about your experience for a full year. You're not allowed to say anything about it. You talk with the shaman and that's it. And even though I think we live in a quite radically different culture, and I would be careful with that, what I do appreciate is that it opens up through the closing of my coworkers. I think those can be forms of creative integration, because you take this sort of juice of a psychedelic experience and you bring it into everyday life. And I actually think psychedelics can help us feel more flow in our life, including in between activities where we're just enjoying the fact that we're on the bike. And so life can become an art form in and of itself. So I'll end there.
No.